All right, we last left off at the Louvre, which is a great architectural project that Louis XIV and his advisor worked on. Colbert undertook the closing of the east side of the Louvre's Court Carré, which was left incomplete by Pierre Lescot in the 16th century. Bernini was originally invited to work on this, however, his proposal would have required a lot of demolition. Three French architects, Claude Perrault, Louis Laval, and Charles Lebrun, worked on the east facade. The design was a brilliant synthesis of French and Italian classical elements, culminating in new definitive formula. The facade has an essential section in the form of the Corinthian temple with a front and a giant colonnade of paired columns on each side. Together, the three sections resemble classical temple with its side folded out on the wings. So here is one section of the Louvre, and you can see this is the section with the colonnade with various columns that are kind of referencing Greek-Roman architecture. And then we have the King's Palace at Versailles. Under the management of Charles Lebrun, the team remodels a simple hunting lodge into the greatest architectural project of age. Divining statement of French Baroque style and a grandiose symbol of Louis XIV's power and ambition. It was planned on a gigantic scale, the project not only for a large palace that was flanking a vast park, but also for the construction of a satellite city to house court and government officials, military, guard detachments, courtiers, and servants. So please pause this video and watch the video on Versailles. This is going to give you an overview of the grounds just because there is a lot to see. It's quite expansive. And here are some still images of the Palace of Versailles. So, you can see it has immense amount of decoration, ornamentation. This is where we're seeing the beginning of the Rococo forms of architecture and art. Rococo is known as being very ornamental, light, airy, and it also has a lot of design that doesn't have a huge amount of straight lines. So a lot of it's very curvy. And we see this in various examples of what we're seeing at Versailles. We see this in the grounds as well. And then we have the Elgis de Dôme. Then we have classical paintings, so principles of classicism, which were determined by Nicolas Poussin. The notes that this artist started were incomplete because of his death. However, what was found or described as essential ingredients are necessary to produce a beautiful painting in a grand manner. This consisted of four things: a subject matter or theme, thought, structure, or style. The first thing is the foundation of all others that is required in the subject matter should be grand as our battles, heroic action, and divine things. But assuming the subject on the painter is laboring and grand is the next consideration to keep away from the minutiae and pay attention to only the things that are magnificent and grand. So classical painting is something we're thinking about next. So it's really key on the subject matter. Really important to have like really strong landscapes, background, really dynamic images. So these are some examples that Nicolas Poussin has, where it's very much telling a narrative, but also showing nature on a grandiose scale. Poussin and Claude Lorrain. Poussin was considered Baroque, but then was credited for starting classical style of painting. The work has a lot of dramatics, but emphasizes the idea of beauty even more. Claude Lorrain also shares this concept, however, makes a much softer approach to this idea. He uses the subject matter that is more relatable, such as using peasants and farmers. So, more examples of classical painting, very large, grandiose landscapes. A lot of the subject matter, is a little bit smaller, so they want to show the grandiose scale of nature. So an artist that's actually not embracing this, that's working during this time, is Louis Le Nain. His work falls more along the lines of contemporary Dutch art than the Renaissance or ancient art. Le Nain treated similar subjects to what would be found in Dutch painting with somber stillness. He portrays peasants, showing them stoic and resigned by hardship. So Linnaean is creating more portraiture, like kind of like what we were seeing in Baroque with group portraits and the Rembrandt, but we're seeing peasants being the main focus, which was a big shift, seeing the folks of everyday life in comparison to what we were looking at with a lot of portraits of royalty. Other artists that embraced hardship or Stoic styles: Jacques Collot and Georges de la Tour. Collot worked on a series of misery of war paintings, which he observed details presenting without common images based on events that he must have witnessed in Lorraine. Georges de la Tour's should have a lot of influence from Caravaggio, especially with the way light was used, making figures have a certain glow about them. So here's Collot. This is a hanging tree etching. So this is done with a printmaking method. So this is showing the horrors and miseries of war. So we see a pretty gruesome scene before us here. So, this classicism is actually showing a lot of, grandiose, tough narratives as well. We also see this with Georges de la Tour. So here you can see the Caravaggio influence with the glow about the figures, but we're also seeing influence of using group portraiture, just like Rembrandt did as well. In England, now we were just talking about France quite a bit, so now we're moving to England. In a sharp distinction to France, Parliament kept royal power in check. So remember, France, a lot of the rulers were able to just kind of go wild with laws that they were putting on their people. In fact, a lot of that eventually led to many wars and big shifts in what we're looking at with France. So the French Revolution happened, whereas England, it differed from France in significant ways. Although an important part of life, religion was not the contentious issue that it was on the continent. The religious affiliations of the English included Catholicism, Anglicanism, Protestantism, and Puritanism, which is the English version of Calvinism. In the economic realm, England was the one country that, other than the Dutch Republic, to take advantage of the opportunities that overseas trade had offered. As an island, Britain, like the Dutch Republic, possessed a large and powerful navy as well as excellent maritime elements. Inigo Jones. This is the most important English architect of the first half of the 17th century. This is the architect to King James I and Charles I. Jones spent a considerable amount of time in Italy. He greatly admired the classical authority and restraint of Andrea Palazzoli's buildings and studied them with great care and treatise on architecture. This is Inigo Jones. This is the Banqueting House in London, England. This is from 1619 to 1622. So, the architecture here, it's a little bit more subtle than a lot of the things that we looked at. It's a little bit more modest, but, you can see a little bit of the Italian influence in there as well. Christopher Wren. Another problem in architecture was Christopher Wren. And London's majestic St. Paul's Cathedral in this work of this architect was based off a mathematical genius and skilled engineer who worked on Isaac Newton's praise and became a professor of astronomy at Gresham College in London at age 29. This cathedral is built in more than 30 years, which is a very short time. So Christopher Wren was quite a brilliant architect who was not traditionally trained and was able to create a work like this. And again, you could see some of the Italian and Greek architecture being influenced in here. And we're also starting to see how this classic architecture is relying a little bit less on historic elements and starting to move forward with newer elements. Rococo to Neoclassicism. So this is 18th century Europe and America. The Enlightenment, Angelica Coffin, and Neoclassicism. The dawn of the Enlightenment in the 18th century brought on a new way of thinking that was thinking critically about the world and men and women independently of religion, myth, or tradition. Enlightenment thinkers rejected unfounded beliefs in favor of empirical evidence and promoted the questioning of all assertions. The New Worldview was a major factor in the revolutionary political, social, and economic changes that swept Europe and America from the mid to late 1700s. Among these were wars for independence in America and France, the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and a renewed admiration for classical art and architecture. Here's Angelica Kauffman. This is her presenting her children as treasures, or Mother of Gracchi, 1875, oil on canvas. Angelica Kauffman was a Swiss artist who was trained in Italy. Kauffman spent many of her productive years in England. She was a founding member of the British Royal Academy of Arts. Cornelia is presenting her children as treasures of the Mother of Gracchi is perhaps Kauffman's greatest work. The theme is the virtue of Cornelia, the mother of future political leaders Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who in the 2nd century BCE attempted to reform the Roman Republic. This is a century of revolutions. In 1700, Louis XIV ruled France as the Sun King. However, by 1800, the monarchs were overthrown by revolutions and America claimed independence from the British colonies. The 18th century gave birth to the Industrial Revolution, which eventually transformed the world. So, during this time, a period called Rococo starts. The death of Louis XIV in 1715 brought about many changes in French high society. The elite quickly abandoned the courts of Versailles for pleasures of town life. Although French citizens still allowed allegiance to the monarch, 18th century brought about a resurgence of aristocratic social, political, and economic power. Members of nobility not only exercised their traditional privileges, such as an exemption of certain taxes from forced labor on public works, but also seeked to expand their power. Paris became the center of a new, softer style called Rococo. Associated with the death of Louis XIV, the Rococo style in art and architecture was a perfect expression of light-hearted elegance that the wealthy cultivated in their opulent homes. So please pause the video and watch a little bit on Rococo. So, a keynote of Rococo architecture was what I started to mention with Versailles, was the fact that artists didn't really use a lot of lines. They used a lot of curved architecture. So, in fact, a lot of times Rococo would ban straight lines. So, a good example of this is the Salon de la Princesse. This is a typical French Rococo room in the Salon de la Princesse, which is the center of Rococo social life. This was reflective of King Louis XIV. It was reflecting a grandiose palace. The new architectural style mirrored the social and cultural shift. Painting, lines, and sculptures created a grandiose ensemble. These salons would typically have very ornamental furniture to accompany these rooms. Femme savants and salon culture. The feminine look of Rococo style reflects the taste and the social initiative of women to a large extent, women domesticated the cultural sphere during the Rococo age. In the 18th century, aristocratic women include Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XIV of France, Maria Theresa, Dutch Archduchess of Austria, and the Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, and Empress Elizabeth and Catherine the Great of Russia helped create some of the most influential positions in Europe. Female taste was also a defining factor in numerous smaller courts of the private sphere. Paris was the social capital of Europe, and the Rococo salon was the center of Parisian society. Rococo does go beyond Paris. Allenberg, which French architects François de Couvy built in the park of the Meihenberg Palace in Munich, a prime example of Germany adopting Parisian style. Balthasar Neumann made more complex designs than Borromini's churches in Rome. The German architect deliberately banished all straight lines. Composition is made up of many ovals and circles. So here we can see an example of that. We see this basically an evolution off of the Salon de la Princesse. And this is the Hall of Mirrors, and this can be found in Munich, Germany. Then this is Balthasar Neumann creating more complex architecture than Borromini in Italy. So you can see it's even more ornamental than what we were previously looking at. This is more Balthasar Neumann, so you can see banishing the straight lines, focusing on curves, ovals. Antoine Watteau. Art historians and scholars most closely associate this artist with French Rococo. This style was based off a painting genre, Fête des Galants, which is the outdoor party. These paintings were referencing outdoor entertainment by French high society. The premier example of his masterpiece, Pilgrimage to Cythera, The painting was Watteau's entry for admission for the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. In 1717, it was not acceptable to submit to that category for submission, but rather than reject Watteau's candidacy, they created a whole new category to permit his entry. At the turn of the 18th century, two competing doctrines sharply divided the membership of the French Royal Academy. Many members followed Nicolas Poussin in teaching that form, which was the most important element in painting, whereas colors in painting are as allurements and are persuading for the eyes. So this is Antoine Watteau. So you can even see, the Rococo is a little bit more light and airy, but then there's still some nods to classicism where you have this grandiose landscape. So again, this was very unique because of, this didn't really fit in any categories to go into this entry. Also to note that there's a lot of cherubs. So the thing with Rococo is there is a lot of play. So sometimes you'll see, a lot of, kind of joyful imagery. Sometimes cherubs will appear. It is very light and airy compared to a lot of things we're looking at. Here's another example of Poussin. So Poussin's kind of, showing a little bit of the classic, creating more of a narrative. So this is definitely in comparison to what we see with Antoine Watteau and Rococo. Pilgrimage to Cythera. Luxuriously consumed lovers make a pilgrimage to the Isle of Eternal Love to the sacred Aphrodite. So this, again, we're talking about the pilgrimage to Cythera. And art historians think that the lovers are returning from Cythera rather than having just arrived. The elegant figures move gracefully from the protective shade of a woodland park filled with playful cupids and voluptuous statuary. The poses of figures blend elegance and sweetness. Francois Boucher, after Watteau's death, this brought a brilliant career to a premature end at age 36. Boucher rose to the most dominant position of French painting. He was Madame de Pompadour's favorite artist, most famous for Cupid a Captive, where he uses rosy figures in contrast with a cool background. Baroque influences are shown in his work. So, again, we have a little bit more of like the light, airy, very much about lightheartedness, frolicking, and we see this with the Cupid a Captive in this work. So I mentioned that sometimes we see the cherubs, in this case we're seeing cupids, some nods to Greek mythology. Another painting that's really kind of like hallmark of Rococo, this is Jean-Henri Frontenard, and this is the swing. So you could see with this image here, we have a lot of kind of comical imagery happening here. So we have the woman on the swing, her shoes flying out in the air here. We have a suitor that's looking up her skirt, and we also have someone over here pulling the swing. So, it's about lightheartedness, humor. So looking at Rococo, what are some things you notice about the style? The color use. How are the figures made? And what about the architecture? So, it is a light and airy style. The colors have a lot of pastels in them. They're a lot more light. The figures are definitely more like voluptuous and round. And architecture has to do with a lot of curves and ovals. So again, like the Rococo has a lot to do with like indulgence. The Enlightenment. This is a really important factor that comes into the aristocratic culture. So this was celebrated in Rococo, but it did not go unchallenged during the 18th century. The feudal system served as a foundation for the social and economic life in Europe, which dissolved the rigid structural hierarchies that provided the basis for Rococo art, and patronage relaxed. By the end of the 18th century, revolutions had erupted in France and America. A major factor of these was political, social, and economic changes that were the influential movement known as the Enlightenment. Newton and Locke. Philosophy and science became more prominent during this time. The work of Isaac Newton and John Locke in England were notable. Newton insisted on empirical proof as his theories encouraged others to avoid the metaphysics of the supernatural. Locke, whose works acquired the status of the Enlightenment gospel, developed these ideas further. Locke's doctrine of empiricism, where knowledge comes through sensory perception of the material world. From these perceptions alone, people form ideas. Locke assured that human beings were born good and not cursed from original sin. The laws grant natural rights of life, liberty, property, and the freedom of consciousness. More on philosophies. French intellectuals inspired by Newton and Locke, these thinkers conceived of individuals and societies as parts of physical nature. They shared the conviction of the ills of humanity which could be remedied by applying reason and common sense to human problems. They criticized the powers of the church and state as irrational limits placed on political and intellectual freedom. Denis Diderot, he became greatly advanced in the Enlightenment, rationalistic, and materialistic thinking. He became the editor of the pioneering Encyclopedia, which is a compilation of articles written by more than 100 contributors. It included the arts, sciences, crafts, as well as religious and moral political theory. Voltaire. Francois Marie Arouet, which is also known as Voltaire, helped introduce the ideas of Newton and Locke into French intelligentsia. He wrote a lot of rebellious books about rejecting high society, religious intolerance, the despotic rule of kings, selfish privileges of nobility, and the injustice of the French. His books were condemned and burned. He protested against the government's persecution of freedoms of thought and religion. He believed people could not truly be happy until traditional obstructions to progress were removed. He also disagreed with the statement that all men were created equal, which were Thomas Jefferson's words. The Industrial Revolution. Research into the phenomenon of electricity and combustion, along with the discovery of steam, had enormous consequences. Steam power was a replacement for animal and human labor. This initiated a new era of human history. Joseph Wright of Derby and the Industrial Revolution. The scientific advances of the Enlightenment era affected the lives of everyone. The most people responded enthusiastically to the wonders of the Industrial Revolution, such as the steam engine. The birth of steam gave way to modern manufacturing economy and the prospect of seemingly endless supply of goods and services. The English painter Joseph Wright of Derby created dramatized scenes of scientific instruments and experiments. This work was appealing to those who encouraged manufacturing. So this is the first work we're looking, influenced by the Industrial Revolution. This is Joseph Wright of Derby, a philosopher giving a lecture on orrery. So basically what this is it's encouraging the idea of industry, science, and revolution. So we see a lot of paintings and a lot of works that are kind of moving toward that. You know, we're also going to see a lot of materials that weren't being used before, such as iron and different metals. We see the introduction of trains. So it's a great time in history at this point. So we'll go ahead and we'll end it here for today.